Strict liability and absolute liability. So, the principle of strict liability evolved in the case Ryland versus Fletcher. In the year 1868, the principle of strict liability states that any person who keeps hazardous substances on his premises will be held responsible if such hazardous substance escapes the premises and causes any damage. And going into the facts of this case, F had a mill on his land, and to power the mill, F built a reservoir on his land. Due to some accident, the water from the reservoir flooded the coal mines owned by R. Subsequently, R filed a suit against F. The court held that the defendant built the reservoir at his risk, and in course of it, if any accident happens, then the defendant will be liable for the accident and escape of the material that has escaped from his premises. So, going by the principle that is laid in this case, it can be said that if a person brings on his land and in that land he keeps some dangerous thing, and if such dangerous thing is likely to cause damage and if it escapes, then such person will be answerable for the damage caused. The person from whose property such substance escaped will be held accountable even when he has not been negligent in keeping the substance in his premises. The liability is imposed on him not because there is any negligence on his part, but the substance that he has kept on his premises is hazardous and dangerous. Based on this judicial pronouncement, the concept of strict liability came into being. There are some essential conditions which should be fulfilled to categorize the liability under the head of strict liability. Now, essentials of strict liability. So, dangerous substances is the essential, first essential. Second essential is it should escape. Third essential is it is a for non-natural use. So, for dangerous substance, the defendant will be held strictly liable only if the substance is dangerous, that has the substance that has escaped from his premises is dangerous. For the purpose of imposing strict liability, a dangerous substance can be defined as any substance which will cause some mischief or harm if it escapes. Things like explosives, toxic gases, electricity, etc., can be termed as dangerous things. Next essential is escape. So this means that the defendants can be strictly liable is that the material should escape from the premises and should not be within the reach of the defendant after its escape. For instance, example, the defendant has some poisonous plant on his property. Leaves from the plant enters the property of the plaintiff and is eaten by his cattle, who as a result die. So the defendant will be liable for the loss. But on the other hand, if the cattle belonging to the plaintiff enter the premises of the defendant and eats the poisonous leaves and die, then the defendant would not be liable, because in this case that dangerous substance has not escaped from his property, from his premises. So in the judicial pronouncement of Reeds versus Lyons and Company, it was held that if there is no escape, the defendant cannot be held liable. Next essential is non-natural use. So to constitute a strict liability, there should be a non-natural use of the land. In the case of Rylance versus Fletcher, the water collected in the reservoir was considered to be a non-natural use of the land. Storage of water for domestic use is considered to be a natural use, but storing water for the purpose of energizing a mill was considered a non-natural use by the court. When the term non natural is to be considered, it should be kept in mind that there must be some special use which increases the danger to others. Supply of cooking gas through the pipeline, electric wiring in a house, etc., is considered to be natural use of land. For instance, if the defendant lights up a fire in his fireplace and a spark escapes and causes a fire, the defendant will not be held liable as it was a natural use of the land. These three conditions that I have told, these three essentials are necessary and to satisfy simultaneously and to constitute a strict liability. Now, there are certain exceptions to this rule of strict liability. So, these exceptions are: first, plaintiff's fault. So, if the plaintiff is at fault and any damage is caused, the defendant would not be held liable as the plaintiff himself came in the contact with the dangerous thing. So, in a judicial pronouncement, Ponting versus Knox, the plaintiff horse died after it entered the property of the defendant and ate some poisonous leaves. So the court held that it was wrongful intrusion and defendant was not to be held liable for such loss. Next is act of God. So the phrase act of God can be defined as an event which is beyond the control of any human agency. Such acts happen exclusively due to natural reasons and cannot be prevented even while exercising caution and foresight. So the defendant would not be liable for the loss if the dangerous substance escaped because of some unforeseen and natural event which could not have been controlled in any manner. Next exception is act of the third party. So the rule also does not apply when the damage is caused due to the act of a third party. So the third party means that the person is neither the servant of the defendant nor the defendant has any contract with them or control over their work. But where the act of third party can be foreseen, the defendant must take due care, otherwise he will be held responsible. For example, in the case of Box versus Job, where the reservoir of the defendant overflowed because a third party emptied his drain to the defendant's reservoir, the court held that the defendant would not be liable. Next is consent of the plaintiff. This exception follows the principle of voluntary non fit injury. So, for example, if A and B are neighbors and they share the same water source which is situated on the land of A, and if the water escapes and causes damage to B, he cannot claim damages as A would not be liable for the damage. Now let's understand absolute liability. So the rule of absolute liability in simple words can be defined as the rule of strict liability minus the exceptions. So in India, the rule of absolute liability evolved by the case MC Mehta versus Union of India. This is one of the most landmark judgment which relates to the concept of absolute liability. The facts of the case are that some oleum gas leaked in a particular area in Delhi from industry. Due to the leakage, many people were affected. The Apex Court then evolved the rule of absolute liability on the rule of strict liability and stated that the defendant would be liable for damage caused without considering the exceptions to the strict liability rule. According to the rule of absolute liability, if any person is engaged in an inherently dangerous or hazardous activity, and if any harm is caused to any person due to any accident which occurred during carrying out such inherently dangerous and hazardous activity, then the person who is carrying out such activity will be held liable. The exception of strict liability rule also would not be considered. So the rule laid down in the case MC Mehta versus Union of India was also followed by the Supreme Court while deciding the case of Bhopal gas tragedy case. To ensure that victims of such accidents get quick relief through insurance, the Indian legislature passed the Public Liability Insurance Act in the year 1991. So, Public Liability Insurance Act 1991. This act was introduced with the aim of providing immediate relief to the people who are victims of accidents in which handling of hazardous substances is involved. The main focus of the act is to create a public liability insurance fund which can be used to compensate the victims. The Act states that any person who is carrying out inherently dangerous or hazardous activities should have insurances and policies in place where he will be insured against liability to provide compensation to the victims in case any accident takes place and some injury occurs. The liability is based on the principle of no fault liability, or in other words, the rule of strict liability and absolute liability. Inherently dangerous or hazardous substance covers under its scope any mixture, preparation, or substance which, because of its properties, can cause serious harm to human beings, animals, plants, property, or the environment. If any substance is inherently dangerous or hazardous due to its handling also, then also absolute liability of the defendant arises. That's all. Thank you.